Hi everyone, welcome to episode 57 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they used to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. If you're connected to the startup ecosystem, I'm sure you would have read the accounts of the sexual harassment scandal sweeping the startup world over the last few months, thanks to some courageous women sharing their story and shining a light on this issue. These accounts led Uber's founder and CEO Travis Kalancik to resign, and one of the bigger pieces to come out recently was a New York Times article that named several influential VCs, such as Chris Sacca from Lowercase Capital and Dave McClure from 500 Startups. Following subsequent revelations of sexual harassment by Dave against a 500 Startups entrepreneur, he has since resigned his post as general partner. All of this comes against the backdrop of Dave McClure being in Melbourne just a few weeks ago to officially launch the 500 Startups Melbourne program, which was part funded by the Victorian State government's $60 million ecosystem development fund, LaunchVic. Caught in the middle of this firestorm was Rachael Neumann, the new venture partner and head of 500 Startups in Australia, who I had arranged a podcast interview with on the 29th of July, the day before the New York Times article was published. As a result, this podcast is split into two parts. The first one covering Rachael's background as the former head of Eventbrite in Australia, where we talk about her experiences and insights into launching into new markets, the importance of having a mindset of abundance, and why you shouldn't build with a focus on being acquired. The second part of the interview was recorded a few days ago over Skype, so please excuse the audio quality. In this part of the interview, we cover what's happened since the New York Times article was published, how much was shared internally at 500 Startups before the revelations came out, the KPIs for the future program, and Rachael and 500 Startups' plan and next steps in building a safer and more inclusive ecosystem. I'm sure there's a lot of interest to hear Rachael's side of the story, so in case you want to jump to part 2 of the interview, it should start around the 47 minutes mark. Without further ado, here is my interview with Rachael Neumann. Hi Rachael, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Just before you head off to the US for 6 weeks.
Yeah, that's right.
As well.
That's usually the ideal timing, start a new job and then go to the other side of the world for 6 weeks.
Absolutely. So first of all, congrats on the new position as well at 500 Startups.
Oh, thank you.
Super exciting. But for anyone that's listening that isn't aware of you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. Again, thanks for having me, and super excited to be working in the ecosystem in this way with 500. So I've actually been living and working here in Melbourne since 2009 with a few stints in between, going back to San Francisco for a few years at a time. So I came out here in 2009 partially because I had graduated business school and I was a management consultant, and I was looking for a part of the world where the economy was not in the dumps, and Australia was fitting that bill. I also was dating an Australian who I have gone on to marry, but that's a different type of podcast altogether. Here in Australia, so I started out as a consultant. When I went back to San Francisco the first time, I got poached by Eventbrite, which at that time was around for a few years, but was like fairly, maybe 200 people. They had just raised like an exciting, but like first of many big raises. And I got brought on as a director of customer strategy. I tell these stories because it was one of those things where like the job that you start with is never the job that you finish with. And I had probably 7 or 8 jobs in between. But one of the best ones was them sending me here to launch Eventbrite in Australia, New Zealand, and grow the team here. So I was managing director for a while here, went back to San Francisco to take on a global strategy role, kind of realized where I want to live and raise my family, and Melbourne's the place. Came back here, have been working in the ecosystem in various roles as a mentor and investor with StartMate, working deeply with a few founders, and then the 500 opportunity came to me. I feel like I kind of still firmly have a foot in both camps. So I spend quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley, quite a bit of time in Melbourne, but this is the ecosystem that I want to invest in. This is the ecosystem I want to kind of double down in and help to grow. Fantastic.
And obviously you mentioned that, the role that you kind of start in within a company is never what you sort of end up finishing with. Specifically looking at your sort of example of being in SF, where I assume that the team was a lot bigger and that's where the headquarters are coming to run the Australian program, where obviously it's a much smaller team. How do you sort of approach growth or approach, the building the business, in two completely different settings? How does the approach change between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just having this conversation with someone today at lunch. But when you're activating a new market and starting a new team, it's a startup within a startup. And so this now will be the second time that I'm doing it. If you actually count Eventbrite, I did it a few times for them in a few different markets. And so if you think about like what an ideal co-founder would look like, that is someone who can, no job is too big or too small. So one of the first things I did at Eventbrite was negotiate a multi-million-dollar contract and buy the toilet paper. And you need to be able to do that kind of all in the same to-do list. So right now, if I'm thinking about who I want on my team, it's people who, want to roll their sleeves up, do 1,000 random things. Some will be like super strenuous, really intellectually challenging. Some will be grunt work, but it's all the stuff that you need to do to make it happen and get something off the ground. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for these like all-rounders. I think as a company gets bigger, and this is the same whether you're founding a company or starting a new market, as you get bigger, that's when you'll start to look for specialization, people who have expertise in certain areas. But I really think like the first few hires that you make have to be people who share your mission and your vision, share your values, have compatible working styles, will challenge you to be better and think differently, and we'll kind of all muck in and get it done.
Sure. How do you have, I guess one of the things that I see with a lot of startup founders is they find it really difficult to not just find co-founders, but as they're continuing to grow, find the right people to join their team. Do you have any recommendations on how do you attract the right people?
I mean, I think attracting talent or attracting customers, like the way that you attract anyone to your business or to your product, I think is about having conviction in what you're doing, being able to articulate that so that people can share the vision that you have, and help to paint a picture for them on what role they'll play in building this, right? So the overused term of kind of capturing hearts and minds really stands here, especially when you don't have something tangible to talk about, right? You might not have revenue yet. You might not have an actual product even in the market. You might not have a customer. And so it's about painting a vision and convincing them that together that's possible. And then I think that you also need to kind of back up some of that BS with some reality as well, and let them know like it's going to be hard and it's not always going to be pretty. And here are some of the things I think I put in place to mitigate those things, but there are no guarantees here. So I think those equal parts of like capture the imagination and inspire them, and then be like brutally honest and really transparent and vulnerable in saying like there are going to be some shitty parts too. Sure.
And obviously I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what are some of the commonalities and the differences between the ecosystems in the US and in Australia that you've seen?
So I don't love making direct comparisons just because it's not really apples to apples, but what I can talk about is what are some of the really exciting things about both ecosystems, and we can kind of decide on our own where we think those compare. What I love about the Australian ecosystem is that it is relatively young, and so there's a real advantage to that. It means that we get to look at all the other like big brother ecosystems out there and decide what are the parts that we want to take because that worked really well. And by the way, we can skip ahead of the 7, 8, 15 years it took for them to trip their way to finding what works. So we can just take the best of it. And then what we want to leave behind, because that's actually not a cultural artifact that we want to bring over here, or that's not a way we want to do business, or that just doesn't fit here in the Australian way of doing things. So I actually think there's a real advantage to being able to pick and choose. And so when I look at the Australian ecosystem, I think the youth works on our side. And then we have all of these amazing raw ingredients. So we have a super, super highly educated population. We have high GDP per capita, high mobile penetration. We actually have a really high percentage of people who are willing to be early adopters. I don't know if it's like widely known, but like a lot of global companies use Australia as their experimentation ground. And they do that because we're actually like pretty open to trying new things here in Australia. And our behaviors are fairly indicative of what other Western cultures, how they would respond to your product or service. So that's a huge advantage. What I actually really love about the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and we're talking in generalizations here, but I think that the collaboration that exists between peers and competitors is unparalleled anywhere else that I've seen or worked. So I think about the example that the co-founders at Eventbrite set for me, and I look at kind of their friendships and their business relationships with people who are like directly their competitors, and the openness and the sharing that takes place is really admirable. And I think that they actually believe that the rising tide lifts all boats. And I look at how venture capitalists behave, and there's an impressive amount of deal flow sharing that happens. If I met someone and either they weren't right for a role for me, or even if they were, but they expressed interest in someone else, like I made introductions. It was just a way that we behave. And so I would love to see the Australian ecosystem, the Melbourne ecosystem in particular, just because that's the one I'm in right now, like adopt that posture of mass collaboration and sharing. And it comes from this mindset of whether or not there's abundance or scarcity. And I think that for too long, and maybe it's because there wasn't enough kind of capital that was opened up here in the markets, but people thought that there was a scarcity. And so you had to kind of compete for small slivers. And actually, I think that not only is that completely untrue, the opposite is true, and that there's actually abundance. And the more people who are successful here, the more abundant the ecosystem and space will be. And so I think if there's one lesson that we can take from Silicon Valley, it's around the collaboration and sharing.
Sure. In terms of changing that mindset, do you think that there's anything specifically we can do to change that mindset, or do you think it's just something that will evolve over time as the ecosystem matures?
Yeah, I think it's a natural evolution. I think as people realize that there's more out there and we can increase the pie together. I think we need to call each other out. So I recently had a conversation with someone, kind of my first duty on the job at 500. We were looking to collaborate with someone, and they said, yeah, that's great. We would love to work with you. We want to be your exclusive XYZ. And I actually said, like, that part is off the table. We're not going to be exclusive to anything, right? And so that wasn't because we don't want to pick partners or we're not willing to pick winners. It's that, like, especially on this situation where it was about opening up our resources, opening up our activities, we want that to be available to as many people as possible rather than few. So we want to take a real open source mentality. Even our accelerator program, which will be highly selective, only 20 to 25 founders will go through the program. While I have that team on the ground delivering it, we're going to have public programs that are happening on a weekly basis. So as many people as possible can get involved. And so, yeah, I think that we need to model the behavior that we want to see. We need to call people out on it when they're not displaying it. And we need to just continue to kind of point to examples of where collaboration has worked to help overall.
Sure. Obviously, I want to come back to some of the stuff that 500 startups will be doing in Australia. But you mentioned a little bit earlier in the show as well that you were involved with doing a few things here to help develop specifically the Melbourne startup ecosystem. And one of those was through your role at LaunchVic. Can you share a little bit about your sort of experience there and the role that you think overall that government should play in developing or supporting the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So I had it was a real privilege to serve on the LaunchVic board for a while. So I think the LaunchVic is a product of Minister Dalidakis's vision for what the ecosystem can be here in Victoria, and is an opportunity where he kind of put his money where his mouth was, and putting $60 million against it. Now, $60 million in the grand scheme of things actually is not a lot of money, but if deployed strategically, it can be meaningful in a young ecosystem. So I think Kate Cornick, who's the CEO of LaunchVic, and her team are off to a good start and are doing a phenomenal job of being excellent custodians of not just that capital that they have available to them, but really thinking more deeply around what is their role around storytelling, around, bringing to light the successes that are happening here, inspiring others to join the startup scene, making it possible for folks to get accelerators and incubators off the ground, creating really interesting co-working spaces. This next funding round, I think the announcement was a couple weeks ago, is focused on refugee and new migrants. Really interesting work to develop this ecosystem and not just have it thrive, but have it thrive in a way that's reflective of the broader Victorian community, which I think is really important. So getting that diversity and inclusion piece in it. So, hats off to LaunchVic, and I don't mean for it to be a shameless plug, but obviously I believe in the work that they're doing. More broadly, I think that the government can play a really important role. And this conversation also came up at lunch today because the person who I was chatting with was kind of comparing it to San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And, obviously the free market has kind of taken over there, and it's a very privatized ecosystem. But a lot of people forget that it was founded on government intervention probably 40 or 50 years ago. So a lot of the money that was pumped into Silicon Valley to get these, chip companies off the ground, to get the those hardware companies that made the region what it is, was defense money and government spending and economic stimulus that was directed in that way. And so I actually think it's a really appropriate role for government to play, to, one, inject capital into a space to market make. And so in places that are not yet commercial, but you need to kind of attract a critical mass to make it commercial, that's the role for government. And then I think the government needs to continue to put sound policies in place that allow for the ecosystem to mature and develop. So this is neither the time nor place, but I think immigration policy needs to support what you're trying to do in the ecosystem, and I question whether or not we have the right immigration policy in place here in Australia to do that. There have been some great policy things in place, around the ability to mobilize venture funds, and we're seeing a lot of those vehicles come to the market, which allows more capital to come in, which is great. And bring tax benefits for both LPs and managers. So there are good starts, and I think to the extent the government can continue to invest in education, so we're developing people for jobs of tomorrow, not jobs of today, can put policies in place that allow for the frictionless movement of capital to invest in these areas where we want it to grow, and then have immigration policies in place so that we can continue to attract and retain the best talent in the world. I think those are critical components of sound policy that will help the overall industry grow.
Absolutely. And just kind of, again, sort of going back, I'm sure there are a few listeners who are either going through this sort of step now where they're looking at global expansion, or hopefully in the next sort of year to 18 months, they'll get to that point. But do you have any sort of experience or learnings from your time at Eventbrite, or either sort of what you're going through now with 500 startups and setting that up here locally, that you can share to startups that are going through that phase at the moment?
About selling globally, kind of thinking.
Yeah,
globally?
about approach and how to sort of enter new markets.
Yeah. So I come from a customer background, so my mantra that I will always repeat over and over is just deeply know your customer, and in particular, deeply understand the problem that you're trying to solve. Too often we get in love with our product or our solution, and we lose the empathy and like the base understanding of why we're even developing this product or service to begin with. And I think that's really important when you go into new markets, is sometimes we have this false assumption that a product is transferable from place to place. And oftentimes the product is, but maybe we need to understand the nuance around the problem. Or we can understand deeply the problem and maybe the solution needs to be tweaked. And so I think that's kind of like my table stakes advice, is anytime anyone's going into a new market, is to really spend time thinking about talking to, observing your customer. And, without them, it's hard to get sales when you don't have a customer. So I think that's always the first bit. And then anytime you're going into a new market, there's a desire to grow fast in startups, and hyper growth is something that's celebrated. And certainly, with my investor hat on, I like when I see my companies experience hyper growth as well. But sometimes you need to take a step back, and before you kind of go into rapid expansion mode, you have to be really mindful about what do I need to understand about this market? What are the nuances that I need to understand? What is the MVP that I need for this market to be successful? And so some examples that I'll give you is when I was at Eventbrite. When I came here to Australia, we were going through a rapid global expansion. And what we found is there were lots of markets that were attractive from like a potential revenue perspective, from a market opportunity, market size, et cetera. But there are funny, quirky nuances in all of these markets. Like in Italy, people buy tickets from the ATM machines, right? And so if we weren't equipped to sell our tickets through ATM machines, like that's probably not an appropriate place for us to operate. Or we can, but we have to downgrade our expectations around how we can perform. And so I think that you need to actually just pause and take some time to understand what are some of those local market nuances and set yourself up for success there. It's funny because in the same breath, I'll also say sometimes the best way to figure that out is to just throw something out there and get feedback from your customers right away. And so I'll just contradict myself, and it's a balance. Sometimes, take a breath, see what you can learn before you have a royal fuck up. When you think you've learned enough to take a punt, get out there and market, get feedback from your customers, and figure out a way to iterate very quickly.
Sure. And you obviously touched on this a little bit earlier in the show as well, but I spoke to Dave Shine, who helped expand Yelp into 30 countries on the podcast a few weeks ago as well. And so one of the things that he sort of mentioned when he was looking to expand was having a really strong core team that came from the local market. Is that something from your experience that you've kind of learnt has been beneficial, or any sort of approach that you've sort of taken in finding the right team members?
Definitely. So it's funny, we at Eventbrite, we take a slightly hybrid approach where we believe, because at Eventbrite culture was so important, and kind of our Eventbrite identity and culture was so important, that we would often seed a new office with existing Eventbrite team members and then build a local team around that. And then that seeded person will either stay and be part of the local team or will go back to headquarters. But we believed that the fastest way to kind of transfer knowledge, to give the team some kind of social capital to navigate, like the back office services and some of the teams, and build relationships, it was actually important to connect someone who knew the ins and outs of the company with, as you said, that important local team. So if you took a look, when I started the Eventbrite team here, when we were super small, 4 people, my head of marketing came from San Francisco and been with the company 5 years or so. So she knew ins and outs, every single person, knew her task, how it, her skill, how it worked at Eventbrite, what metrics mattered, et cetera. She knew it inside and out. And then we hired a local salesperson and a local account manager. And I think you actually need to think about the roles as well. So it was super important here in Australia for us to have a local salesperson, local account manager. For our business, in particular, Australian organizers wanted to know that we're local. It didn't matter that we were this San Francisco-based company and we were in 187 countries and blah, blah, blah. They said, well, what do you have here on the ground? And so they actually wanted a very hyper-local experience and a very Australian-centric experience. And so not that we were specifically looking for anything in particular in our hiring process, but when we found a great candidate who also was Australian, we found that resonated really well with the Australian organizers. Initially, we had someone, while I was building up that team, from the San Francisco office who was playing that role, and he was awesome and successful in market, but I could see how more successful the local Australian team was able to be on that kind of organizer, kind of customer facing stuff. So I really like the local team and the seeding. So bring in someone who can help you navigate the business.
Fantastic. And so coming to 500 startups now, again, I'm sure 500 startups is something that most listeners are aware of and comfortable with. But for anyone, again, that's listening that may not be as familiar with the brand that 500 startups is, can you sort of share what 500 startups does and how they help?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first and foremost, we're a venture capital fund. So right now we have over $350 million under management in our first 3 funds. We're currently raising a 4th fund and an opportunity fund. From that capital, we've invested in over 1,800 companies around the world. 500 is probably most famous for its Seed Accelerator program that's based in San Francisco and Mountain View. We have run over 20 batches through that accelerator. And our accelerator is a great way for early stage companies to really accelerate their growth, as the name suggests. In particular around distribution, customer acquisition, and really kind of next level their product and service and their business. Our accelerator program has provided just a small portion of the pipeline of the companies that we invest in. It's an important one, but it's just a small portion. And so our presence in Australia is kind of a mini microcosm of what we do in San Francisco. So we're going to take that accelerator program and condense it into this super intense 6-week program here in Melbourne. We're going to parachute in 20 to 30 of our experts, our entrepreneurs in residence, our managing partners, our founders, our serial entrepreneurs, our investors, parachute them in to deliver this program. And then, while they're there, do a bunch of other ecosystem building while we're here. But like I said, we also are a venture fund, so we are looking to make investments in great founders and great companies here in Australia. So the 500 portfolio already has invested in over, I think, about 20 Australian companies. Some of our favorites are probably Canva, UpGuard, Happy Co. Not just our favorites because they're doing well, but it's great to see that they are doing well. And we expect Australia to be a greater source of excellent companies in our portfolio going forward.
Fantastic. And so obviously the 6-week program, the applications are currently open. So if anyone's interested in applying, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so that website is 500melbourne.co. Applications are open now. If you actually follow me on Twitter, which is rnewman6826, I'll be announcing the exact program specifics in real time. So we're just locking in those dates. But you can roughly expect it to be running in November until mid-December.
Yep.
So applications will be open for a few more weeks. Then we'll have a selection process and an interview process to help curate this first batch that we'll go through.
Fantastic. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. But for anyone that's thinking of applying and wanting to know, how do I get in to the program? What is it specifically that 500 Startups is looking for?
I like chocolate. I like champagne. So we're actually, especially in this first batch, we're industry agnostic. And that's for a number of reasons. This is a young market, and we're here to learn. And I think that if we narrow our focus too quickly, we're going to lose out on some great entrepreneurs and some great companies. And to be honest, Australia is good at lots of different things yet. We haven't really identified we are better than the rest of the world in X, Y, and Z yet. We still have an opportunity to determine what those things are. And so for that reason, we're not going to narrow the focus, especially not in this first batch. We also think that, I definitely believe that founders come in all shapes and sizes. I want a very diverse cohort here that reflects the broader ecosystem. So in particular, I want gender diversity to be present. And in the coming weeks, I'll make some commitments around how I expect that to play out. I want to see some founders that are kind of beyond the usual suspects. And then I think, but that said, we do have a sweet spot. So I'll tell you, I think our sweet spot is that you have a product, or at least a pretty good MVP. It's in market. You have early traction with at least a few customers. And the reason why it's important to have some of that is when you come into the program, the first thing we do is we sit down and we kind of set out what the goals are. And the goals aren't just like wishy-washy. They're like very concrete goals. I want to increase my customers from X to Y. I want to increase revenue from, A to B. And so if you're coming off a base of 0, it's really hard for us to set some very tangible goals that we can hold our founders accountable to. And so we do want to have, a product and market, a few customers, ideally a little revenue that we're working with. So it's okay if it's super early stage. That's also our sweet spot. So from an investment perspective, we write checks that are between 100 and 250K, with the ability to go a little bit up and a little bit down. But that again is that's our goal. And so we want companies that fit that bill. The companies are probably also thinking about what our program looks like. Those are the companies that are going to thrive based on the experts that we're bringing in. I think companies that have like really high CapEx requirements up front, like microchip companies or, deep research, hard tech, that's probably not ideal for the program just because we won't be able to see the progress over 6 weeks that some of these other companies would.
Sure. I'm sure that you're not really going to have a problem in getting a lot of applications in terms of sort of filtering through the different types of startups and the different opportunities that you're seeing. Is there anything in particular that for yourself individually you will be sort of looking out for or things that would sort of stand out to you?
Again, I always come back to when a founder is able to like very clearly articulate the customer problem that she or he is trying to solve, and has a compelling rationale for why he or she is the right person to solve it, and they have a hypothesis on what the product is that is going to solve it. Like those are the 3 magical things that I want to see. I actually care less about what the product or solution is right now because there's a very good chance that's going to change, and there's actually a pretty good chance it's going to change over the course of the program. But what it shows to me is, you're customer backed and you have a deep empathy. This problem matters to you. And so like, this is not a sport for the weak, right? This is some hard stuff. And so unless you have a personal reason for why you go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning and think about that problem, it's going to be hard to get through some of these pits. And then, if you tell me what your solution is right now, I might not think it's the right one, but I'll admire your creativity or at least like the intellectual approach that you've taken to coming up with that solution. So those are like the 3 magic things that I'm looking for.
Is there anything that would turn you off immediately from an application?
I'll tell you the companies that I hate. I hate companies where in the first breath they tell me this is who we are and this is what we do, and this is who's going to buy us. So companies that are building with an exit in mind or building to be acquired, there's very little that I can get excited about there. So it's funny because we're investors, and so we want returns for LPs, and returns come in the form of exits or various liquidity events. And so we definitely want those to happen, but we want founders and teams to be building products and companies that are enduring. When you're building for acquisition, you're oftentimes shortcutting. You're putting things together with duct tape rather than thinking about what is a sustainable business model? What is the sustainable architecture that I need to build to make this product stand up? And so I want to see people who believe that they're going to be building a independent, sustainable company, not something that is an acquisition target. I think once you build that company that is amazing, then we could start to talk about exit options. But if you're motivated by that, it will be reflected in the product you build. It'll be reflected in your lack of consideration for your customers. It will be reflected in the way that you treat partnerships, in the way that you have a short-term view on sales, and it will always come back to bite you.
Sure. And obviously, I assume that there's a lot of crossover between the two, but what are some of the things that the venture side of 500 startups, when they're looking to invest in companies locally here, that they would look for?
Yeah, so the same thing. So even though right now the batch that we're bringing through our program is for educational purposes, when I'm assessing a company to come into the batch, it's with an eye towards I would like all or most of those companies to be investable. Because what a great pipeline that is for me. So that doesn't mean that being through our program guarantees a check. But it means that if we think that you're high quality enough to go through the batch, then it would stand to reason that we would have you on our radar to make an investment. Now, the reason that we're not writing a check at the start of the program, as some other accelerators do, is we want to give ourselves actually a bit of flexibility to find some diamonds in the rough that aren't yet ready for investment, but are ready for us to invest our time and energy and people resources into. And so I think that by not, and there are also lots of other great companies that we want through the program that aren't raising right now, and they don't want to give away equity, even if it means a cash injection. So we thought that by making an educational program, we don't limit ourselves, but having the checkbook ready on demo day gives us the optionality to be able to invest in those companies that fit the bill.
Fantastic. And obviously, one of the things that you sort of mentioned about the program would be bringing in sort of world-class founders and mentors to come in and not just support the program, but also support the ecosystem overall, which I think is hugely beneficial. But again, what are some of the things that you think will help take either the Victorian or the Australian startup ecosystem to the next level?
It's just, it's more rev, right? It's every time you try something and you try it again and again and again, you get better at it. Or maybe you still suck, but you've learned some lessons. And so with a young ecosystem, the problem is not with the talent. The problem is not with, in this case, like access to capital. The problem is not with lack of customers. The problem here is just we're early. So we just need to have lots of rev, right? We need to have 100 kicks on goal before we get really good at it. And so I think that the more people we can get in and start experimenting, start playing, start their first company, fail, start their second company, fail, start their third company, they're really onto something, right? So I actually think it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of getting more people involved. It's a matter of signaling both in our words, in our actions, in our funding, that this is an ecosystem for everyone. And so getting people involved that don't look like the typical entrepreneur, that haven't necessarily been told that they can be an entrepreneur. We need everyone to come in. And so the wider we can make the funnel, and the more experience we can inject into it, the more success we'll have at the other end.
Sure. Just on the point of the having more revs and 100 kicks a goal, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast a few times as well, but I was at a sort of roundtable discussion about how do we sort of help support the Australian startup ecosystem. And obviously there was a lot of talk about how we bring people in. So how do we get people who are in the corporate space or people who potentially haven't thought of themselves as entrepreneurs to start thinking more like that? But obviously, the figures are, 9 in 10 startups fail on the first round. And again, as you sort of touched on, it's about, how do we get them to keep sort of doing that? The hard part that can be culturally over here is once you've failed, that people sort of jump back into the corporate space or kind of find it too difficult and leave. How do you, I guess one of the things that I'm really passionate about is like, how do we sort of create an environment where we, support those people and not lose those learnings, so that people can go and apply those lessons that they've picked up from their first failure and sort of keep trying and apply that back into their second, third or fourth startup.
You've touched on a few important things here. So one, what makes Australia so amazing but also somewhat challenging for the startup ecosystem is that the BATNA, kind of the alternative to the startup ecosystem, is like pretty freaking cushy. We have like a really strong economy. There are lots of really comfortable corporate jobs that range from being like not so interesting to like pretty interesting, and they pay well. And so they're really good fallback plans. So on one hand, we can say that prevents people from taking having another go. On the other hand, we can say, why not have a go? If you have a really comfortable fallback plan, why not? Like, everyone should just try. I think that we need to change the culture of failure. I don't really know what that means. And so, like, we say it, but we don't really know what that means. And, like, there are some fail cons and, like, some cool kind of meetups where people share failure stories. I think that's all great. The real question is whether or not investors will come back to a founder after he or she has failed once. I think that's the real test, because it's one thing to say, like, yeah, we celebrate failure and to give everyone a pat on the back, but whether or not he or she can be set up for success the second and third time will be a real test of the willingness and tolerance for risk and failure that this system can bear. My guess is that we're not where we need to be yet. I wish that I had more like concrete ideas on how we can get there. I think that, I also think that corporates actually have a really important role to play in this ecosystem. So I don't know if I'm kind of taking us off on a tangent, but some of the work that we do with 500 globally is connecting startups with corporates. So corporates will come to us and say, hey, we would really love to learn from a startup that does X, or we have this problem that we haven't been able to solve internally. Can you find someone who can externally? And we either look within our portfolio, or sometimes we just search globally, and we connect them, and then we kind of help them to work well together. And there's a really awesome symbiotic relationship that can happen there, where corporates can solve real problems that they haven't been able to do internally because they're too big, because they're not nimble, because they've been thinking about the problem in one way. And so they get their problem solved. They get to see a different style and pace of working. They get to be inspired by that. They learn how to work with, small, nimble companies that behave very differently than themselves. And the startups, get access to those customers. They learn how to, sign a deal with a big corporate. They learn how to navigate the political realities of large companies. And so it's a huge learning opportunity for both. And I think when done well, is highly, it's high impact. And we've seen some cases where those corporates have acquired the companies. We see where they become, partners and service providers. So it often ends up being a real win-win all around. So, I don't know if that had answered the question directly. There's one other thing that you touched upon earlier that I just want to talk a little bit about the 500 investment model around. You said 9 out of 10 companies fail. This is a high-risk game. And we acknowledge that, and the way that we try and combat that is through math. And so the 500 philosophy is high-volume investing. So like I said, we've invested in over 1,800 startups around the world over the last, call it 7 years. And we believe venture capital is really high risk, and it is impossible to guarantee any returns. That said, you can start to mathematically or statistically predict how outcomes will look, and the way that you get better predictive values is with a higher end value. And so that's what drives our investment approach and process of writing a lot of checks. And so when we look at our models and we zoom out, and you see a shape that has been made up of 18 lines, you start to have confidence in that shape, versus you look at other funds where they might have 10 or 12 or 4 companies in their portfolio. It is a bit of a coin toss at that point, even though, with all due respect to the venture capitalists out there, they are probably extremely well skilled at making good bets. We kind of compensate for our shortcomings through high volume. And so I think that's what makes us different in the investment side. I think it's what makes us different for potential LPs who want to kind of de-risk a high-risk asset class. And so we have like a fair level of confidence around how each fund is going to perform because our end value is so high.
Sure. On that, obviously, I know that you're sort of very new in the role, but as Dave McClure mentioned at the event, announcing sort of the launch of the 500 startups in Australia, that 500 now has invested in over 1,000 startups. Is that
1,800?
1,800.
Yeah.
What are some of the learnings that have sort of, or the trends that you've seen come out of the 1,800 investments that have been sort of taken?
Yeah. So actually, I asked Dave about that because I said, like, if we run a regression, what are the kind of key attributes that we can say are predictive values of success? And he's like, yeah, there are none. That's why you just have to take a lot of kicks on goal, right? To reuse the metaphor I used earlier. So what he said, the only thing that is predictive is like mathematically what outcomes will look like. So it's, 50% are going to be dead in the first year. In our portfolio, we have like 1 or 2% that will become unicorns, another 5 to 7% that will be centaurs, and then about 20 some odd percent that will go on to have like, a decent return, which is 1x and up. And so the only way that we have our confidence around being able to share those numbers is because we have 7 years and 1,800 lines in that model to suggest it. But, if there was some magic value, like the founder needs to look like this, and she needs to be from here, and it needs to be focused on this, like, it just isn't, there aren't those magic elements. And so I do think that there are certain patterns that you can start to detect, and a good VC's job is to figure out what are those patterns that work in your market that you have confidence around and you believe will make you a differentiated investor. I'm not going to share with you what I think my patterns are. But I think that, where patterns stop being predictive, that's where you want to have your high-end value instead.
Fantastic. On that note, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today. For anyone that wants to get in touch, say hello, find out more, obviously considering that you're traveling over the next few weeks as well, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so drop me a line. My email is nice and easy. It's rn@500.co. So drop me a line if you want to chat. Please, if you think you're interested, go check out 500melbourne.co. Information on the program will be there, an application for the program. And like I said, follow me on Twitter, rneumann6826, and I'll be dropping program details in real time.
Fantastic. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes again. Just quickly, when's the deadline for the applications?
I think we're going to close it up on August 30th.
Okay. So still a bit of time, but better to get it in.
2 months. Early. Get going. Gives you some time to get that product in the market, get your early customers, get that early traction, get ready for the program.
Fantastic. Rachael, once again, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Bye.
The following is part 2 of my interview with Rachael Neumann. Hi, Rachael. Welcome back to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks again for taking the time to re-record this part of the interview on your trip. Obviously, a lot has happened since we first spoke, a couple of weeks ago. And everything that's sort of come out. I just wanted to get your sort of side of the story and everything that's sort of been happening over the last few weeks.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back, and apologize that my voice has deteriorated quite a bit since we last spoke, but hopefully we'll be able to push through. So needless to say, it's been a pretty tough job. So Saturday was my first official day. I was actually in the air flying to New York with my family, and landed to the very shocking news that had come out in the New York Times. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can discuss here, but the way that it boils down, I think that there are a few issues at play. I think we'll probably only be able to touch on a few of them, but at least I wanted to kind of list them out. I think the first issue is whether or not the 500 program should be in Australia. The second one is the direct actions of Dave McClure. The third one is the questionable decision by the 500 leadership team to send Dave to Australia for our launch and represent the organization without disclosing any of this information with myself and our partners on the ground. And then I think fourth is kind of more broadly thinking about the culture in startups and VC and the inhospitable environment that is created, which is really standing in the way of a diverse, inclusive, and representative community. The first one's easiest to address because obviously I took the role because I unequivocally believe that the program is world-class and that it fills a real gap in the Australian market. And I think the rest of the podcast that we recorded last week will address more of my thoughts there, so I don't want to spend more time there. but that said, the program is no longer just the vacuum, which brings me to issues 2 and 3. On Dave's behavior specifically, it is inexcusable, and it's not representative of 500's culture, its values, nor is it representative of the culture and values that we want to foster here in Australia. And end of story. There is nothing there to unpack other than I'm glad that I joined a company that had values that are aligned to my own. I still believe that those are the values that are core to that company. And for that reason, I'm glad that that's been taken care of the way that it was. The third is, I think, like the stickiest issue for us here in Australia, and that is that the news clearly blindsided all of us. So definitely me, LaunchVic, who's the partner that helped make it possible for 500 to Australia. Minister Daladakis championed it. It blindsided the whole community. And quite frankly, it was a terrible way for major stakeholders and a new employee to find out about this. I felt shocked. I felt appalled, betrayed, confused. I went through an entire range of emotions. And I have to be honest, I nearly resigned a number of times just over the last week. But here's where I landed. One, it was 100% the wrong call for the leadership team to send Dave to Australia and not inform any of us of what was going on. Two, here's where what the public has heard and has read about the situation is all part of the story. So these issues are very complex. What I've learned over the last couple of days as things have unfolded is that most people only get to see part of it. And there's nothing here that excuses things, but there is information that I have now learned that allows me to understand it. And the third point is that I don't envy Christine Tsai, our co-founder and now CEO's position. It was an unbelievably tough situation. And while I would like to have believed that I would have made different decisions, we all have the luxury of judging from the sidelines. And I have quite a bit for just the position she had to navigate. I think there's that, humans make mistakes. That's why I love AI companies. So I think that the net of this is an awful situation to have happened first and foremost to the women who bravely spoke out and those who haven't spoken out but have been put in situations where they are uncomfortable, where they are violated in some way, or where they're made to feel small and powerless. So first and foremost, that is really where our energies should be focused. Second, it's an awful situation that a really great program and an amazingly good team in the Global 500 team this start in Australia, because I do believe that there's an opportunity for a real impact to be made here. And then the great irony is that I actually think that this is a really important inflection time for our community and for 500 and for it's one of those ironic things where it's going to be positive that this is all coming to light, holding up a mirror to our kind of collective culture. And hopefully now we'll be really galvanized and catalyzed to do something about it. I know that I'm, more fired up than ever. And so it's my goal to, make this be a net positive and have something really good and, set the bar high for what we need to do in Australia to come out of this.
Sure. I mean, I guess one of the things that you sort of touched on there was just the shocking nature of all of the revelations. And I think you kind of mentioned this, from the outside looking in, I don't think any of us were expecting anything to happen. And I think the big part of the revelation that, there was internal investigation going on and Dave had stepped aside from that. I guess from just what I've read and from my own kind of personal views on this, I think it was just a little bit difficult for everyone to grasp of how much information of what was happening being shared internally at 500 startups, and how much of that was then reflected in kind of the external communications, or for example, Dave coming out to Australia. So do you have any kind of insight or anything in terms of how much was being communicated or being sort of made aware of what was happening internally at 500 startups prior to the New York Times article?
Yeah, sure. So No one internally, aside from the leadership team, knew about this internal investigation, and that's because there is extreme privacy and delicacy that needs to be considered when these investigations are underway. So the party involved was the one who actually requested to have confidentiality and privacy around the issue, and in American, employment and HR law, it is not uncommon for that request and for that request to be granted that extreme privacy and is dealt with when handling this. Certainly during the investigation, next to nobody will know that it's underway, and then even when a conclusion is made, there are privacy laws that protect the parties involved. And so for that reason, I certainly, as a new employee, but I would say 99% of the team internally also were not aware of these investigations happening. And so again, I do believe that the management team's decision to send Dave to Australia was wrong. But that said, I understand where they weren't at liberty to give details to external partners because they were bound by law to respect privacy and confidentiality around the issues. So, here's where it just gets extremely complex. I can't speak into detail, one, because I don't have the details, because I know enough to understand what was at play, but I don't know anything more because, I don't have the right to that information under confidentiality and privacy laws as well.
Sure. And what's the feeling internally at 500 startups at the moment with the people that are currently working and currently hired by 500 startups, and obviously the teams that are
we first of all, it's a global team. We're spread out all over the world, but we have the ability to communicate through Slack and lots of internal chatter, and I feel like everyone went through a very similar emotion roller coaster. So first feeling shock, appalled and betrayed that our leader was behaving in this way, and that things were happening that people who were quite senior and were well trusted in the organization felt like they weren't part of the conversation. And then I think it very quickly turned into an incredible amount of camaraderie and resolve for how 500 is so much bigger than one person, that there is so much important work still to be done, that when you look at 500's track record and its areas of focus, it actually is so much around representation of women, representation of minorities, Black, Latino, LGBT, non-traditional founder archetypes. It is so core to what 500 does, not just in words, but we dedicate funds to it, we dedicate programs to it. Our team, both on a leadership team and the greater team, is very, I would say, atypical than your typical VC fund, given the diversity that's on the team. I think 67% of the executive management team is women. Over 44% of the entire VC is women. We have an incredible representation of people of color and non-white minorities. And so I think very quickly, when people got over the initial shock and anger, it's like, we are 500. We know what that means, and we have work to do. And it's also been hard in Australia because we have this additional scandal. I don't know if I want to use that word, but the additional, I would say, complicating issue of Dave having just been in market 2 weeks ago. But the actual support that 500 has been getting from around the world has been really remarkable. So incredible support from our LPs and our various funds, from our major partners like Stanford and Deloitte, with whom we do business around the world, from other governments where we work. And I think that actually has been really encouraging when our important partners and LPs and founders and members of our accelerator program turn to us and say, we know what 500 stands for. We know that you're so much bigger than one person, and we got your back. And I think that has really put a lot of wind in our sail and given us the strength to push through.
Sure. And obviously, again, there's been a lot of talk about what should happen with the funding, with the use of public funds that the LaunchVic has to fund 500 startups, and obviously a very tricky situation for all involved. But obviously there was an update that came out today that was published in the Australian about essentially a pause, from what I understand, on the program itself, and I guess from what I understand, LaunchVic essentially saying that there needs to be some sort of cultural change, and 500 startups needs to make those changes in place. So what do you and 500 startups plan to do to bring about change to the community? And overall, I think if there's anything to kind of come out from this, it isn't just a 500 startups problem. I think it's just a general wider ecosystem issue, as we've seen through multiple different instances coming out. What is the 500 startups, along with the wider startup ecosystem and community, can do to help bring about these changes?
Yeah, I'm going to just unpack that question a bit. So first and foremost, we have decided to postpone the program, and with deep consultation in the Grant LaunchVic and 500. That's largely where my voice has gone weak. Again, apologies for that. And so the reason we decided to land at postponement is one, I think that people on either sides of the fence were saying, keep pushing through, do the program, we need it in Australia. The other side was saying, they lied to you, Dave McClure's actions are inexcusable, we don't support that, yank the funding. And actually, we realized that there is a middle ground. What the postponement does is it recognizes that the 500 program is still outstanding. It's still world-class, and we still think that it has a place in Australia, full stop. On the other hand, the program can exist without the community embracing it and supporting it. So the program is amazing, and we get amazing outputs when we have founders and companies going into it. So before I kick off any sort of program, I need to know that we have community support, not just because I need, the companies to get into it, but, the whole purpose of bringing 500 to Australia was to serve the community. And so if the community doesn't feel like they're the right partner, that we're the right partner, then we don't have the right to be here. And so I think that we have two jobs now. One is to rebuild and regain trust within the local ecosystem. And it's actually been pretty amazing. I don't know if you've seen in the social media channels, but since the announcement of the postponement has come out, the support for 500 remaining in Australia has actually been really overwhelmingly positive and very encouraging. And I just, really thank the community for backing us in that way. But still, I recognize that I still have a big job ahead of me to rebuild trust, to get the community on sides. And the way that I'll do that is reorienting the program to just be more overtly communicating the work that is already inherently in our program, which is around diversity and inclusion, and ensuring that the portfolio that we bring through our accelerator and eventually invest in is representative of not just the wider community, but the community that we want to see. And so this is where, when we were consulting LaunchVic and thinking about what would a remedial program look like that very much not just achieves the original outcomes of us being in Australia, but now these, tackling these larger issues head on, that's where actually we got really excited, because one, that's already what we do. So now we just have an opportunity to ramp it up and communicate it more clearly. Two, that's what we believe and that's what we want. And three, now we have an opportunity to really push our thinking, get super creative, work really hard, and not just bring a world-class program to Melbourne, but start to set the bar for what our programs need to look like around the globe. So this postponement for us, I think, is the best possible outcome for all parties involved. Because, like I said, it gives us time to do the work we need to do to rebuild the trust and relationships with the community. But also it gives us a chance to put together a program that will far exceed the one that we had on deck, which I thought was already amazing, just a few weeks ago. You started to ask about, kind of what we can do more broadly and to address some of the more systemic issues. And so I guess I don't really have an answer for you yet. I certainly have my individual opinions. I certainly have, been deeply passionate about these issues for a long time, and have done lots of reading and learning and listening. But I actually want to hold back on being prescriptive about solutions right now, because I actually think for the next few weeks it's more about listening. I only represent some of the, quote, groups within our community that are either marginalized or underrepresented. I'm a woman, I am a lesbian, but there are lots of other groups that right now are not necessarily the center of the dialogue. We need to make sure that they are part of the conversation, that they're part of the narrative, that they are heard and listened to. And so for the next few weeks, once I'm back in market, it's going to be less about coming up with solutions and more about listening. And then I hope collectively, as a community, as an ecosystem, we start to put in place, broad community goals, and then specifically hold individuals and organizations directly accountable for how their work is going to contribute to those larger goals.
Sure. And in terms of the program that you will essentially be running, the delayed program, are there any changes to the KPIs and internally for 500 startups? And obviously, I don't know how much you can share around this, but in terms of a LaunchVic funding perspective, has there been any changes in terms of the structure of that, or how that will be sort of allocated based on the changes?
Yeah, and that's the process that happening now. So once we agreed to pause the program, yesterday, we now have a very very tight timeline for us to put together this remedial program to redefine what success looks like, and to renegotiate, rediscuss all of that with our partners at LaunchVic. So absolutely, that is something that needs to be redesigned. That's something that will happen very quickly. That's something we will be held accountable to, and that's something that I plan to share very publicly. So not just LaunchVic, but the whole community can hold us to account.
Sure. And in terms of the postponement of the program, is there a specific timeline that's been agreed, or is that still kind of very much up in the air?
So not yet. And the immediate timeline is in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The new program will be locked in and approved. At that point, we'll be able to communicate what that program looks like. I should say, 1, what the objectives of the program are, 2, what that program looks like to meet those objectives, and 3, what are the specific logistics around that program, around timing and criteria, et cetera. So we expect to communicate that all in the next few weeks.
So Rachael, obviously you mentioned that listening will be a big part of your sort of role over the next few weeks and months. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you, and what is it that you're sort of hoping to get out of speaking to members of the community?
Yeah, well, so first of all, people are always welcome to email me or call me. My email is rn@500.co, so please get in touch. We can grab time on the phone, we can grab a coffee when I'm back in Australia, but also as soon as I'm back, I'll be actually holding roundtables and breakfasts and events, and just trying to get out there as much as possible. I think that there is really important dialogue that needs to be had around a number of issues. And actually, on August 2nd, Startup Victoria is going to be holding an event at One Roof with a great panel, and I encourage everyone to go there also as a start. But I guess what I'm looking for is, I'm looking for people to share their experiences with me, because I think this is the same with any good startup or product. that before you jump into designing a solution, you have to truly understand what the customer challenge and the customer pain point is. So the first thing I need to do is have a deep understanding of what are the various experiences and challenges that we're solving for. I can only speak to the ones that I've had personally or the ones that I've heard about secondhand, but I think we all have to do a lot of learning and listening so that we understand really what are the underlying issues at hand. I think once we have an appreciation for that, we can start to really think about what solutions are. So, to the extent that people feel comfortable and able to share, I think the most important thing right now is to tell stories, to tell experiences. Let us kind of get to a place of understanding and empathy of what we're actually trying to solve for. And then I have no doubt that with the creativity and, smarts in the room and across the community, that we'll be able to come up with some pretty interesting approaches to solving it.
Fantastic. And as we've kind of touched, I think it's a wider ecosystem challenge as well. I think 500 startups should be one piece of that puzzle, but I think to make a really big sort of cultural shift, it's not just up to one person or one organization to make those changes happen. But hopefully this is the start of some sort of positive change and much needed change as well for everyone to feel a lot more comfortable and safe in the space. Rachael,
absolutely.
Rachael, once again, thanks so much for jumping on for both of the interviews, and looking forward to what the next steps are from here.
Thanks, and thanks so much for having me back. And expect more news to come as soon as it unfolds.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Rachael.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks for listening to episode 57 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As I mentioned in the interview with Rachael, I think there's a wider cultural issue that needs to be addressed, and it isn't just up to one person or one organisation to make a positive change in the community. If we're really serious about competing on the global stage, we need to create an environment which is supportive and safe regardless of your gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or coming from other diverse backgrounds. This change won't happen overnight, but we can all take our own positive steps towards making this a more inclusive ecosystem. For me personally, that starts with doing two things. So first of all, I was rightfully called out by Eloise Watson, Vanessa Hutchinson, and Paul Naftali, three of the amazing people at Rampersand VC, about not having enough diversity in the guests I have on the show. As Vicky Lay pointed out in the last podcast interview, it's important to showcase positive role models that look like you to inspire others to do the same. And so I want to make a more concerted effort to showcase more diversity in the show. If you have anyone in particular you would like to hear from in future episodes, send them my way or send me a tweet or email with their name and I'll get in touch with them directly. On a side note, our next live podcast event will take place on the 23rd of August at the York Butter Factory with the amazing Kate Morris, the founder of Adore Beauty. I'll add a link to the registration page in the show notes, which are available at startupplaybook.co. And secondly, breaking down barriers can be really difficult. If there's any way I can help by being a sounding board for ideas or introducing you to much smarter people than me, shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co or find me on Twitter at Bhargava7. I'm always up for a tea or a chat over the phone. Finally, a special thank you to Drew Corby from the Pathways podcast for letting me test out his mics for this interview. For those of you listening at home, let me know what you think of this new setup. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 58 next week.